Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to, well, strip away the noise, ignore the usual stories you hear, and really get into how global power actually works.
Exactly. And today, we're doing something pretty crucial. We're looking at the 19th and 20th centuries through a very specific lens, one designed to look outside the usual ways society, classifies things.
Yes, the safe ways.
Right. Our main source is Professor Carroll Quigley's huge work, Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time.
And people say it's, clearly one of the most important books ever written. That's the quote, right?
That's the one. And the claim is pretty bold.
Right.
If you haven't really grappled with this book, you can't actually understand the 19th and 20th centuries.
It's more than bold. It's basically saying standard history lessons are missing the point. Quigley, he was this brilliant historian, but his real focus wasn't just teaching facts.
No, it was teaching techniques, methods of analysis,
Yeah.
showing undergraduates how to look past what everyone just sort of agreed was true.
Right, finding the underlying reality.
Precisely. So our mission today is to use that Quigley lens, to get underneath the accepted cliches, slogans, and self-justifications. His words that governments and, institutions put up like shields.
To protect the real workings.
Yeah. We're trying to free up our understanding from those standard frameworks we all inherit. Because Quigley argues those frameworks, while you need them for basic talk, often just block us from seeing what's really going on.
Okay, so we're going deep, looking at the architecture of global power, the systemic shocks of war and depression.
And tracing that slow internal decay of Western values. But first, we need to understand Quigley's starting point. How history itself actually moves, the dynamics. So Quigley doesn't see history as just one event after another. He sees it as a system. He breaks culture down into 6 levels, interacting.
Okay, what are those?
They go from abstract to concrete, intellectual, then religious, social, political, economic, and finally military. And he says civilizations tend to follow 7 stages.
7 stages, always.
Well, he posits it as a general pattern. Mixture, gestation, expansion, conflict, universal empire, then decay, and finally invasion. It's a cycle.
It sounds a bit fixed, like destiny. But what's the engine driving it? Especially the move from that golden age of expansion into, conflict or decay.
That's the key mechanism he identified, the institutionalization trap.
The institutionalization trap.
Yeah, and this idea is, it's incredibly powerful because it challenges the whole idea that organizations are built to last effectively. The rule is simple, almost brutal. Every instrument becomes an institution.
Instrument becomes institution. What does that mean in practice?
Think of an instrument as something created for a specific purpose. Let's say an army formed purely to defend the borders. That's its job. When it's new, it's focused.
Oh, makes sense.
But over time, things shift. The relationships inside the organization, the rules, the promotions, who reports to whom, the internal politics, getting funding, those become the main goals.
So the original purpose, defending the country, it just slides down the priority list.
It becomes secondary. Exactly. And then there's what Quigley calls the egocentric point of view.
Meaning?
Everyone inside is human, right? They want a raise, a promotion, an easier job, more influence. It's natural. But pursuing those personal goals takes up time, energy, resources.
That should be going towards the main goal.
Right. It diverts the organization's focus, makes it less effective, less able to adapt.
It gets rigid.
And this isn't just theoretical. You see it playing out tragically, leading up to World War I in the military tactics.
Oh, absolutely. The rigidity of the European military commands before 1914 is just staggering, especially when you think about the cost in lives. Take machine gun.
Yeah.
It's basically perfected around 1862, a devastating defensive weapon. Yet for decades, over 50 years, military institutions, especially the infantry and cavalry guys, clung to these old shock tactics, the bayonet charge, the cavalry charge with sabers.
Against machine guns. Because the institution valued tradition. It valued the prestige of the cavalry officer, the discipline of the charge. That internal stuff mattered more than the reality of this deadly new instrument, the machine gun. The institution protected itself, not its soldiers.
It protected its own structure over its actual function.
Precisely. And then there was the doctrine of the straight front. Even worse in some ways.
What was that?
In 1914, the rulebook said generals had to keep their battle lines straight and unbroken to protect supply lines, avoid getting outflanked.
Okay, that sounds logical on the surface.
But think about it. If your soldiers found a weak spot in the enemy line and broke through, the doctrine often forced them to stop, halt the advance, wait. and then throw their reserves, their reinforcements, against the strongest parts of the enemy line.
That's completely counterintuitive. You'd want to exploit the breakthrough.
Exactly. But the institution prioritized the rule, the straight front, over the tactical reality. The goal became follow the doctrine, not win the battle effectively.
Then there was
Maximize casualties. Millions dead at places like Verdun, the Somme, wasted lives, charging machine guns because the institutional dogma was more powerful than military common sense. It's a perfect, horrific example of the trap.
So it took someone breaking the rules.
Yeah, like Ludendorff in March 1918. His infiltration tactics were the logical opposite. Bypass the strong points, hit the weak ones, surround pockets of resistance.
Did it work?
His advances were huge, spectacular, got close to Paris, but they were ultimately stopped. Quigley sort of hints that maybe even Ludendorff couldn't fully shake off the old institutional mindset to push it all the way.
Wow. Okay, so beyond the military, Quigley saw other cycles, broader ones.
Yes, like the demographic cycle, how population patterns shifted, spreading out from Western Europe. He identified 4 stages based on the death rate high, then falling, then low, then eventually rising again.
Which affects population growth, stable, rising, stable, falling.
Right. But the critical thing he points out is the psychological adjustment. When a society gets used to constant growth, expansion, things always getting better.
And then it slows down. Maybe because the system itself, the instrument of expansion, has become institutionalized and less dynamic.
Exactly. That's when you get what he called the tension of evolution.
Tension of evolution.
People have adjusted their whole lives, their expectations, to constant improvement. When that stops or slows, they get disappointed, restless, and perhaps bitter.
Yeah.
That's his phrasing.
And they blame the government or the economy.
Without maybe realizing it's a natural consequence of the system maturing, or rather, ossifying. The instrument becoming an institution.
This also ties into how Western ideas spread, right? Things like industrialism, nationalism, democracy. It wasn't even...
Not at all. Nationalism, for instance. Quigley points out it was strong in England way back in 1588 with the Armada.
Okay.
But it only really hit Germany and Italy after 1815, after Napoleon, and China, India. Not really until the 20th century, a huge lag.
And this uneven spread caused problems.
Big problems, especially in places on the periphery adopting these Western traits. Germany is his classic example of modifying the package deal.
Oh, so.
The Germans wanted the power of industrialism and nationalism, badly. But they looked at Britain and France and thought, we can get there faster if we ditch the liberalism and democracy part.
So they prioritized.
Ruthlessly. They chose nationalism achieved by blood and iron, as Bismarck said, and state-controlled industrialization. Forget the slow, messy development of liberal institutions like in Britain.
Which meant when these ideas spread even further, say to Russia,
the receiving cultures changed them even more drastically. The Soviets, for example, prioritized state power and rapid industrialization above all else, leading to, immense rural oppression and the horrors of the 5-year plans, partly to avoid relying on foreign capital. They took the Western model and twisted it into something very different.
Okay, let's shift from those broad historical sweeps to the nitty-gritty of economic power. Quigley saw a major change happening there, too.
A huge shift. Driven partly by technology, less need for manual labor, but a much greater need for mass consumption. Someone had to buy all the stuff being produced.
Right. And the structure of who controlled the economy changed.
Fundamentally, especially after 1900. The rise of the corporation meant ownership got spread out among lots of shareholders. So control didn't really lie with the owners anymore.
It shifted to the managers, the professionals running the companies.
Exactly. And this really accelerated after World War II. It led to this mass middle-class society, not the simple owner versus worker world Marx predicted. It was a kind of leveling. The poor came up, the super rich, at least their visible liquid wealth, maybe came down a bit.
But Quigley argues this visible change was hiding something else, a deeper concentration of power.
That's his really radical claim. He talks about the money power, and he states it flat out. In the years leading up to 1931, bankers, especially the money power controlled by the international investment bankers, were able to dominate both business and government.
Dominate? How?
By controlling the supply of capital. Investment banks, the huge ones, Rothschild in Europe, Morgan in the U.S., they decided which industries, which companies got the money to grow and which didn't.
So they held the purse strings for the whole industrial economy.
And they used that power. They took seats on the boards of directors, not just of the big industrial firms, but also commercial banks, insurance companies, utilities.
Through interlocking directorships, the same people sitting on multiple boards.
Right. It created this dense network of control. They weren't just passive investors. They were actively shaping industries, pushing for mergers and amalgamations to reduce competition and consolidate their own influence. They were wiring the whole system.
And this wasn't some secret conspiracy theory. People knew.
At the highest levels, it was openly acknowledged. Quigley digs up this absolutely stunning quote from Walter Rathenau, the big German industrialist and politician from 1909.
What did he say?
He said, 300 men, all of whom know one another, direct the economic destiny of Europe and choose their successors from among themselves.
300 men. Wow. That's incredibly concentrated and self-perpetuating, like a private club running the continent's economy.
Exactly. But Quigley says this wasn't just economic power. It had a social and political dimension, too. Which brings us to these elite, semi-secret organizations he talks about.
Okay, this is where it gets into the really controversial stuff, right? The Anglo-American establishment.
It is. It starts, according to Quigley, with Cecil Rhodes, the diamond magnate.
Right. Rhodes scholarships and all that.
Yes, but Rhodes had a much bigger vision. He believed the key to world peace and progress was the unity of the English-speaking peoples, and he decided to use his massive fortune to achieve this. But not openly.
Covertly.
Yes. He set up a secret society, formally in 1891. Its goal was to exert influence through, and this is Quigley quoting the aims, secret political and economic influence behind the scenes, and crucially, by the control of journalistic, educational, and propaganda agencies.
Controlling the narrative.
Absolutely. And he put his money where his mouth was. He made Lord Rothschild the banker, and W.T. Stead, a very famous journalist, trustees of his will to carry out this plan.
So bankers and media figures right from the start.
Yeah. And the key political engine for this became what's known as the Milner Group.
Milner. Alfred Milner.
Yes, Lord Milner. The group started as his kindergarten, bright young men, mostly recruited from Oxford and Toynbee Hall between about 1897 and 1905. They were brilliant, ambitious, and deeply committed to the empire.
They became powerful.
Incredibly powerful. They essentially became the nerve center of British imperial and foreign policy, dominating it right up until World War II.
What was their driving idea?
Unity of the empire, but based on ideals of freedom, plus this very strong sense of duty and obligation to serve the state. They were very idealistic in their own way, but also very pragmatic about power.
How did they operate? Was it all secret?
There was an inner core, the Milner Group itself, but to extend their influence, they set up these semi-secret discussion groups called Roundtable groups.
Roundtable, like King Arthur.
Kind of evokes that image, doesn't it? They set these up between 1909 and 1913 in the main British dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and, significantly, in the United States. They all kept in touch, shared ideas, coordinated through correspondence, and their own magazine, the Roundtable.
So an international network.
A very influential one. And then this inner structure created more public-facing organizations, think tanks, essentially.
Which ones?
The Royal Institute of International Affairs in London Chatham House, founded in 1919, heavily funded by elites like the Astor family.
Okay, I've heard of Chatham House.
And its sister organization in the U.S., established around the same time, the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR.
The CFR. Still very influential today.
Very. According to Quigley, these weren't separate entities acting randomly. They were part of this coordinated network, stemming from the Rhodes-Milner vision.
And how did they get political clout? These were academics, administrators.
They allied with and utilized the existing political power of what Quigley calls the Cecil bloc. That's the powerful Cecil family and all the other aristocratic families connected to them through marriage and history. That gave the Milner Group the political muscle, the access that Milner himself didn't initially have.
So it's this blend of intellectual power, financial backing, media influence, and old aristocratic political connections.
A potent combination. Quigley describes it as a system where the establishment identifies promising young talent, often at Oxford, brings them into the orbit of places like All Souls College, tests their loyalty to the group's ideals by giving them chances in public life.
And then integrates the successful ones into the network, into Chatham House or the CFR, ensuring the vision continues across generations. It's quite a picture he paints.
It's a picture of deep, embedded structural power operating behind the public stage.
Okay, let's pivot back to the major events. Quigley identifies 3 huge shocks in the 20th century: World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II.
Yes, but he singles out World War I as the most fundamental trauma. Why? Because it just shattered those core 19th century beliefs.
Which were?
The belief in the innate goodness of man and the belief in inevitable progress. The war made those ideas look naive, almost childish.
And that loss of faith had consequences.
Huge ones. It led to the 1920s being this strange period Quigley calls an effort to fail.
Effort to fail. What does that mean?
He means the dominant drive among the elites after the war from 1919 to 1929 was desperately trying to restore the world exactly as it was in 1913.
Pretend the war hadn't fundamentally changed everything.
Exactly. Trying to paper over the grim reality of the 20th century, as he puts it, with this old facade, trying to ignore the deep economic shifts, the psychological wounds.
Which wouldn't last.
No. The 1929 crash and the Depression just ripped that facade away completely. The effort to restore 1913 failed spectacularly.
And amidst all this chaos, these attempts to turn back the clock, Quigley points to manipulations still happening behind the scenes, using money and influence.
Oh, constantly. He gives this really cynical example about how Italy got into World War I on the side of the Allies.
The Entente powers needed Italy. How did they manage it?
Through, and this is Quigley's term, the skillful expenditure of money. Bribery, basically.
Who did they bribe?
The money was specifically targeted to split Italy's main anti-war political force, the Socialist Party, which was mostly pacifist.
And how did they split it?
By funneling large sums of money provided by the French government to one specific, ambitious young socialist who was arguing for intervention.
Let me guess. Benito Mussolini.
You got it. Mussolini was kicked out of the Socialist Party for his pro-war stance, but he immediately used this French money to start his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia.
So foreign money basically launched his political career.
Quigley argues it was the essential launchpad for his unprincipled career, leading directly to fascism. It shows this direct link. Secret foreign funding creating political extremism and instability.
That kind of backroom dealing helps explain why things like disarmament failed so badly after the war, doesn't it? All those conferences between 1919 and 1935.
They were completely deadlocked. There was this fundamental disagreement that just paralyzed everything.
What was the core disagreement?
You had two camps. On one side, the pacifists, mostly the English-speaking countries, Britain and the U.S. Their argument, the direct approach was, weapons cause wars, so let's get rid of the weapons first. Disarm now.
Sounds reasonable enough.
But on the other side, you had the realists, France, and its Eastern European allies, the Little Entente. Their argument, the indirect approach, was the complete opposite.
Which was?
They said, fear of war, insecurity. That's what causes countries to arm themselves. So you need security first, guarantees, alliances, before you can expect anyone to disarm.
Security first, then disarmament. France felt threatened by Germany, obviously.
Terribly threatened. It was almost a national obsession. But Quigley claims the English-speaking countries, and he specifically links this back to those Milner group circles in London, just refused to see this. They failed to grasp the depth of French insecurity.
And actively worked against French efforts to get security guarantees.
Actively blocked them. Every French move to strengthen its alliances or its own defenses was viewed with suspicion or hostility in London.
Which leads to the Locarno Pacts in 1925. Quigley seems to think these were not what they appear to be.
He views them with extreme suspicion. He says flatly they were conceived in the same London circles which had been opposing France, supporting Germany, and sabotaging the League of Nations.
Sabotaging France? How could a treaty guaranteeing borders sabotage France? That sounds contradictory.
It's subtle but devastating. The main part, the Rhine Pact, guaranteed the border between Germany and France against unprovoked attack. This looks good, right? Defense. But France also had treaties promising to help Poland and Czechoslovakia if Germany attacked them. That meant France might have to attack Germany's western border to fulfill its promises.
Okay.
The way Locarno was written, if France launched such an attack to help Poland or Czechoslovakia, France could technically be seen as the aggressor on the Western Front, and Britain, Belgium, and Italy, as guarantors of Locarno, might then be legally obligated by the treaty to help Germany against France.
Wait, Britain might have to fight with Germany against its own ally, France?
That was the potential trap embedded in the treaty structure. It effectively neutered France's Eastern alliances. It turned France's promise to help its allies into a massive potential risk to itself.
That's not incompetence. That sounds like a deliberate strategic move to isolate France.
That's certainly how Quigley presents it, a legal landmine, and it fits perfectly with the next phase, the policy of appeasement towards Hitler in the 1930s.
Which Quigley argues wasn't just weakness or naivete.
No, he insists it was a calculated strategy, driven by powerful anti-communist, anti-Soviet figures within that same London elite network, people like Lord D'Ebernon, who had been ambassador to Berlin, Jan Smuts from South Africa, Sir John Simon.
And their goal? What was the strategy behind appeasing Hitler?
Quigley quotes sources stating the aim was to tear down France and build up Germany. Why? To make Germany the chief bulwark against communism in Europe.
Use Hitler as a weapon against Stalin.
That seems to have been the core strategic calculation for some key players. They saw the Soviet Union as the bigger long-term threat. They were willing to let Hitler expand eastward, absorb Austria, Czechoslovakia, maybe even move against Poland, hoping he would eventually clash with Russia, weakening both.
Sacrificing Eastern Europe to contain communism.
And this wasn't just wishful thinking. Quigley provides evidence of secret last-ditch efforts to make this happen, even in the summer of 1939.
Just before the invasion of Poland, what happened?
In July 1939, senior British figures R.S. Hudson, Sir Horace Wilson, who was very close to Prime Minister Chamberlain, secretly met with Helmuth Voltat, a top Nazi economic official.
And what did they offer?
Astonishing things. A non-aggression pact between Britain and Germany. An agreement dividing the world into spheres of economic interest. Even potential colonial concessions to Germany.
This was after Hitler had taken Czechoslovakia, while Britain had a guarantee to Poland.
Yes. And the smoking gun, according to Quigley, comes from the German diplomatic report of the meeting written by Dirksen, the ambassador. It apparently quotes Wilson directly.
What did Wilson supposedly say?
The report states, Sir Horace Wilson definitely told Herr Wolf that the conclusion of a non-aggression pact would enable Britain to rid herself of her commitments vis-a-vis Poland.
Wow. Basically offering Hitler a green light for Poland if he signed a deal with Britain, allowing Britain to ditch its public promise.
It suggests a desperate, secret attempt by elements within the British government to stick to their anti-Soviet strategy, avoid war with Germany, and let Hitler deal with Poland, even if it meant betraying public commitments. It shows this deep split between public policy and the private aims of some power brokers.
Okay, let's jump forward to the post-World War II era. Quigley also analyzed the economic successes then, like the West German economic miracle.
Right. How did Germany recover so fast after being devastated? Quigley says their post-war economy was actually the closest thing around to old-school 19th century laissez-faire.
Really? How so?
It was a combination of factors. Relatively low wages, a surprisingly cooperative, docile labor force, brand new, highly efficient factories because the old ones were bombed.
And low taxes, especially on businesses, on producers.
Exactly. Plus, the creation of the European Common Market gave them this huge, ready-made export market. So their production costs were super competitive globally, and their exports boomed.
And Japan. Similar story after the war.
Similar successful export-led recovery, yes. But Quigley also looked back at Japan's pre-war economy, which was quite unique, especially in the 1930s.
What was happening then?
Well, Japan's military expansionism forced a shift in their economy, from light industry like textiles towards heavy industry steel, chemicals, engineering needed for armaments. This happened roughly between 1933 and 1938.
Okay, so they're building more weapons. What's the economic impact?
It created a huge squeeze. Building heavy industry requires massive imports, iron ore, coal, oil, metals. But shifting away from textiles, their main export, meant they had less ability to pay for those essential imports.
So their need for imports went up, but their ability to earn foreign currency went down.
Precisely. It led to a terrible trade deficit. Huge pressure on their gold reserves, massive economic strain inside Japan, which, Quigley suggests, only fueled their political aggression further. It became a vicious cycle.
Now let's tackle maybe the most unusual economic idea from Quigley. His analysis of the post-war American economy. He said it wasn't really about scarcity anymore.
Yeah, this is really counterintuitive. His core argument is that the U.S. economy, especially after WWII, had enormous unused potential. He talks about two ceilings.
Two ceilings.
There's the real resources ceiling. That's the absolute maximum the economy could produce if every factory was running full tilt, every worker had a job, all raw materials were being used. It's way up high.
Okay, the theoretical max output.
But then much lower down, there's an artificial financial ceiling. This is set by things like the amount of money in circulation, tax policies, how much credit is available. It's a limit imposed by the financial system, not by real resources.
And the actual economy operates somewhere below that financial ceiling, with slack capacity.
Often, yes, with idle factories, unemployed people. Now, here comes the radical part. Quigley argues that certain kinds of government spending, big projects like the defense budget or the space race, could actually have negative real costs.
Negative costs. Spending money makes you richer. How does that work?
Because the spending injects money into the system. It pushes that financial ceiling upwards, closer to the real resources ceiling.
Okay.
That upward pressure activates some of that idle capacity. Factories start up again, engineers get hired, and here's the key. If the total value of the new goods and services produced by activating that idle capacity is greater than the value of the resources the government initially spent.
Then the spending actually increased the total national wealth.
Exactly. The net effect on real resources is positive, even though money was spent. The effort generated more wealth than it consumed. It completely flips conventional economic thinking about government spending being just a drain.
It implies that in an economy with lots of slack, large-scale investment isn't just moving wealth around, it can actually create new wealth.
That's the implication. A very controversial one,
Yeah.
but central to his view of the modern American system.
Okay, moving beyond economics, Quigley was also very concerned about, well, the mindset, the ideology underpinning Western society. He connects Germany's path, for instance, not just to politics, but to a psychological trait.
Yes, he talks about German egocentricity.
What do you mean by that?
He argued that culturally, many Germans tended to carry forward an intense kind of childhood egocentricity into adulthood, a profound difficulty in seeing things from any viewpoint but their own or their own groups.
How did that manifest?
In really strong social divisions and hostilities, even while they talked about national unity. My political party is the only right one, my favorite composer is the only great one, my town's traditions are the best. This intense, almost tribal loyalty combined with an intolerance for other viewpoints.
So lots of internal conflict despite the image of rigid solidarity.
Yes. And Quigley felt this deep intolerance was fundamentally alien to the core Western tradition, which, however imperfectly, had generally moved towards accepting diversity and difference over centuries. He saw this trait as a source of instability when things got politically stressful.
And this connects to a broader crisis he saw in the West, particularly affecting the middle class.
Yes, what he called the destruction of future preference.
Future preference, what's that?
It was the whole mindset, the psychological engine of the 19th century middle class. The belief in saving money, working hard, thrift, discipline.
Delaying gratification now for security or success later.
Exactly. Postponed enjoyment.
Yeah.
Constant striving. Never being quite satisfied with the present. Quigley believed this outlook, this future preference, was absolutely essential. The indispensable foundation, he calls it, for the West's huge material progress. It generated the savings, the capital needed for investment and innovation.
But he saw this mindset disappearing or being attacked.
Under relentless attack, what he calls an attack from within, primarily coming from 20th century culture, literature, theater, drama.
How so?
Think about how middle-class life is often portrayed in novels and plays from that era. It wasn't usually heroic or aspirational.
More often critical.
Satirical. Exactly, yeah. Quigley notes that even writers who weren't overtly radical, writers who sort of accepted the basic middle-class ideology like Booth Tarkington, often still depicted that life as, his words again, a horror of false values, hypocrisy, meaningless effort, and insecurity.
So a constant cultural barrage against the very values that built the system.
Right. And the long-term effect, he argued, was profound. It helped turn normal adolescent rebellion against parents into something deeper. A wholesale rejection of all middle-class values by younger generations, especially in America. It created this huge cultural gap.
And who fills the gap left by this faltering traditional middle class?
Quigley identifies a rising group. The petty bourgeois.
The petty bourgeois. Not a flattering term. What defines them, and why are they succeeding?
He argues they succeed not because the old middle-class virtues, things like imagination, broad perspective, balanced judgment, no. They succeed because of, well, less admirable traits.
Such as?
Neurotic drives of personal ambition and competitiveness, great insecurities and resentments, narrow specialization, and fanatical application.
Ouch. So the hyper-focused, intensely driven specialists.
Yes. The functionaries, the careerists, climbing the ladder in big organizations, corporations, government, academia, the military, they thrive because the modern institutionalized environment rewards that narrow focus, that relentless drive, more than it rewards the older, broader, maybe more humanistic qualities of the past middle class. They're perfectly adapted to the institutionalized world. So what Quigley gives us really is this incredibly challenging framework. It's a systemic view of history. Power isn't spread out. It's concentrated, often hidden. Economic forces often matter more than political speeches. And institutions, well, they almost inevitably end up serving themselves rather than their original purpose.
Yeah, through that process of institutionalization and self-interest, it forces you, the listener, to really question the standard historical narrative you get.
Absolutely. And the most provocative piece, the part that really lingers, is his detailed description of these interconnected elite groups. The Milner Group, the CFR, the RIIA, the influence of the money power.
Groups working behind the scenes for decades, shaping policy, sometimes in ways that directly contradicted what the public was being told. We saw that with Locarno, with the appeasement strategy right up to the wire in 1939.
It suggests that when you see a pattern of, say, policy failures that seem inexplicable, or decisions that just don't make sense on the surface, like clinging to bayonet charges against machine guns.
It might not just be incompetence.
It might not be incompetence at all. It could, Quigley implies, actually be the successful implementation of a different unstated agenda. Maybe it's just the institution preserving itself, or maybe it's the strategic goal of a hidden network. The outcome serves some purpose, just maybe not the one you think.
So we have to leave you, the listener, with a final thought, a challenge, really, based on all this. Given these historical patterns, institutions solidifying, power concentrating, narratives being used as shields.
What current dominant cliche, what widely accepted idea or category that you hear about every day might be hiding a completely different, maybe contradictory reality underneath?
What fundamental assumption do you hold about how the world works today that you might need to actively question, to unlearn, if you really want to be well-informed?
Because if Quigley is even partly right, the history of the world, and maybe the present too, is rarely what it seems on the surface.
Go forth and question everything you think you know.